The first signal arrived as a bruise on the sky, a distortion so slight that most instruments filtered it away as background noise, the cosmic equivalent of a stutter in a sentence too long to notice. Humanity noticed anyway, because humanity had learned, across centuries of false alarms and genuine catastrophes, that the universe rarely knocked politely. The signal bent spacetime by a fraction measurable only to a rays stretched across lunar farside craters and the cold void beyond Mars. And when analysts finally stopped arguing about calibration errors, the conclusion carried the heavy certainty of gravity. Something massive had arrived just outside the heliopause, and it had not come by accident. Marrow Hale stood in the observation gallery above the deep analysis pit, watching data cascade down holographic sheets like rain falling upward. She had not slept in 30 hours, and the fatigue gave the world an unreal sharpness, as if everything had been etched too deeply. Below her, technicians and theorists moved in quiet urgency, voices low, hands precise, every gesture shaped by training and a shared understanding that panic wasted time. Humanity had learned that lesson too, though it had taken a cost paid in cities and oceans and generations. The object beyond the heliopause did not resemble any ship humanity had imagined. It was not sleek or symmetrical, not a blade or a spear or a shining disk. It was a continent of machinery, a drifting accumulation of structures fused together by technologies that ignored aesthetics in favor of function. Its mass rivaled that of a small moon, yet it moved with deliberate grace, altering trajectory in ways that mocked classical propulsion. There were no exhaust plumes, no radiation signatures that fit known drives. It simply went where it decided to go. "They are not hiding," said Rithan Iqbal from somewhere behind Marrowan. He was a systems philosopher by training, a discipline born when humanity realized that understanding machines required understanding the minds that built them. "They want us to see them." Marrowan did not turn. "Or they do not care if we do." "That is worse," Rithan replied. Humanity had broadcast its presence for centuries, first with naive optimism, later with cautious restraint, and finally with a kind of stubborn pride. The idea that the universe might ignore them entirely had been more unsettling than the fear of invasion. Now, with the signal undeniable and the object vast, the old debates felt small and outdated, like arguments over shadows while a storm gathered overhead. The first message did not arrive as language. It came as mathematics layered with physics, an introduction written in the only alphabet the cosmos guaranteed both sides would understand. The message described constants, referenced pulsars, mapped hydrogen spin transitions, and then, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, defined a coordinate system that placed Earth neatly at its center. Only after that did symbols appear that could be interpreted as intent. "We have observed you. We have measured you. We will now engage." The words were not transmitted as sound or text, but the translation software rendered them with stark simplicity, stripping away ambiguity like flesh from bone. There was no greeting, no apology, no threat, just a statement of fact. Marrowan finally turned to face Rithan. "Engage how?" Rithan's expression was tight. They did not specify. The object altered course, decelerating until it matched the sun's motion through the galaxy, an act that required an energy expenditure beyond anything humanity could generate in a year. It did not cross into the inner system. It waited, patient and vast, as if confident that time itself was on its side. Humanity responded, because not responding had never ended well. The reply was cautious, layered with redundancies and disclaimers, a diplomatic overture wrapped in equations and definitions, offering communication, cooperation, and peaceful exchange. It took less than a minute for the answer to arrive. "We do not seek exchange. We seek assessment." Assessment was a word humanity understood too well. It was the word used by empires before annexation, by predators before choosing prey, by committees before decisions that changed lives without consent. The alien message continued, unfolding with relentless clarity. Your species has expanded rapidly. You adapt to hostile environments. You modify yourselves and your tools without regard for long-term equilibrium. You consume stellar resources. You propagate conflict beyond your point of origin. You represent a variable with unbounded growth. Marouin felt a cold settle in her chest. They think we are a problem to be solved. Rithan nodded. Or eliminated. The assessment outlined criteria, thresholds, and historical precedent. The civilization that had built the object was ancient, older than humanity by orders of magnitude that made recorded history seem like a flicker. They had encountered other expanding species, and they had developed a methodology. Observe, measure, intervene if necessary. Intervention did not always mean destruction. Sometimes it meant containment, restriction, enforced stagnation. Other times it meant erasure. Humanity's leaders convened across planets and habitats, arguments flaring and cooling in cycles measured by orbital mechanics. Some advocated for immediate attack, a desperate gamble against a foe whose capabilities were unknown but clearly immense. Others argued for submission, for offering concessions, for proving harmlessness through self-imposed limits. Still others insisted on deception, on hiding growth and masking potential, on appearing smaller and weaker than reality. Marouin listened to all of it from her position at the edge of decision-making, her role advisory but her conscience deeply entangled. She had grown up on a generation ship that never reached its destination, repurposed mid-flight when Earth's needs changed. She had watched communities uprooted by policy shifts justified by survival metrics. She knew what it meant to be assessed by distant powers. "They do not understand us," she said during one closed session, her voice steady despite the weight of attention. "They think growth is our flaw. They do not see that it is also how we survive." A representative from the Jovian habitats responded with weary skepticism. "Survival is not their concern. Stability is." "Stability for whom?" Marouin asked. No one answered. The alien object transmitted again, this time with a proposal. They would test humanity's response to constraint. A region of space at the edge of the Kuiper Belt would be sealed, rendered inaccessible by fields that bent causality itself. Humanity was to accept the loss without resistance. Compliance would be noted as a positive indicator. The region contained mining operations, research stations, and tens of thousands of people who had chosen to live far from the sun's warmth. Evacuation was possible but costly. Resistance was theoretically possible but likely suicidal. Public reaction was immediate and volatile. Protests erupted across habitats, not in rage but in fear. The idea that an external power could simply take space, could redraw the map of human existence without consent, struck at a core belief that had driven expansion in the first place. Space had been freedom. Now it was a ledger entry in someone else's assessment. Marouin watched footage of a miner named Caleth Rourke speaking to a local feed, his face lined by radiation exposure and long years in low gravity. "We went out there because no one owned it," he said, "because it was open. If we give this up, what do we become? Tenants in our own sky." The governing council voted narrowly to comply. Lives could be saved, war could be avoided, humanity would demonstrate restraint. The alien fields activated with indifferent precision. Ships attempting to cross the boundary vanished without explosion or debris, simply removed from the universe in a way that defied description. Evacuation was rushed and incomplete. Some refused to leave, either out of defiance or disbelief. They were gone. The next message arrived within hours. "Your compliance is noted. Your distress response indicates attachment beyond utility. This suggests inefficiency." Marouin slammed her fist against the railing hard enough to bruise. "They are judging us for caring." Rithan's voice was hollow. "From their perspective, caring is noise." The assessment continued. The aliens demanded further concessions, each framed as a test. Reduction of expansion rates, dismantling of certain technologies, disclosure of genetic modification programs. With each compliance, the criteria shifted, the bar raised, the definition of acceptable narrowed. Humanity complied until it could not. When the demand came to abandon faster-than-light research entirely, to cap knowledge itself, something broke. It was not a single speech or vote, but a collective realization that survival at the cost of identity was a slower form of extinction. Marowin was present when the decision was made to refuse. The response was not immediate annihilation. It was something worse, a clinical explanation. You have failed the assessment. You exhibit traits correlated with future destabilization. Intervention will proceed. Intervention began with precision strikes against infrastructure, targeting shipyards and energy nodes, crippling mobility without destroying population centers. The message was clear. Humanity was to be immobilized, contained within a shrinking sphere of influence, allowed to exist but not to grow. Panic spread, then fury, then a grim resolve. If this was the end, it would not be met quietly. What the aliens had not accounted for, what their models could not easily quantify, was humanity's response to being cornered. Growth had always been paired with adaptation, and adaptation with creativity born of desperation. Technologies long considered impractical were resurrected. Alliances formed between factions that had once been bitter rivals. Scientists worked alongside soldiers, artists alongside engineers, all driven by the same unspoken understanding that this was not just a war for territory, but for the right to define their own future. Marowin found herself at the center of a project that had been dismissed for decades as philosophical indulgence. The idea was simple and absurd, that the universe itself could be persuaded, not through force, but through demonstration. That intelligence could be shown, not asserted. That humanity could redefine the parameters of the assessment by changing what was being measured. They see us as a variable, Rithan said, as they stood before a simulation of cascading probability fields. So we changed the equation. The plan was not to defeat the alien object, but to confront it with something it could not easily categorize, a choice, a sacrifice that served no strategic advantage, an act that contradicted every efficiency model. Marowin looked at the projections, at the risks that were barely contained by hopeful assumptions. They will think we are irrational. Good, Rithan replied. That means we are still human. As the alien fields tightened and the stars seemed to pull away, humanity prepared not for a final stand, but for a demonstration. The universe had come to measure them, and for the first time, humanity intended to answer on its own terms. The project that would come to be known as the Measure Initiative did not begin with machinery or equations, but with an argument about meaning that lasted 14 hours and ended only because the participants ran out of stimulants and coherent speech. It took place in a sealed chamber beneath the Pacific platform, a city anchored to the ocean floor by pillars thicker than mountains, built in an era when humanity believed permanence could be engineered. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Marowin Hales sat at the center of the circular table, not by authority, but by accident, having arrived early and chosen a seat that no one bothered to contest. Around her gathered people whose disciplines rarely overlapped, except in crisis. Theoretical physicists who treated reality as negotiable, sociologists who mapped civilizations as if they were weather systems, engineers who had built engines that bent spacetime, and ethicists whose job was to ask whether bending spacetime had been a mistake in the first place. Above them, the walls displayed shifting models of the alien object, its structure annotated and re-annotated as new data arrived, each revision erasing certainties that had lasted mere minutes. "They are not gods," said Kareth Moan, a gravitic engineer whose hands shook when she spoke, not from fear but from suppressed energy. "They obey rules. We just do not know all of them yet." "That is irrelevant," replied Ocean Vale, a cultural historian whose work had focused on collapsed interstellar societies. They do not need to be gods to end us. They only need to believe that doing so is justified. Marowyn listened, absorbing the rhythm of the debate. The Measure Initiative had been framed as a way to exploit a blind spot, but blind spots were only invisible until someone pointed them out. The aliens had demonstrated a fixation on quantifiable traits, growth rates, energy consumption, expansion vectors, conflict metrics. Humanity had been reduced to a dataset, a curve trending upward toward an unacceptable threshold. The initiative proposed to introduce a variable that resisted quantification, not by hiding it, but by amplifying it beyond the aliens' ability to interpret. "We keep saying they do not understand us," Marowyn said, when the room finally paused long enough for her voice to land. "But understanding is not binary. They understand what they care to measure. The problem is that they think measurement equals comprehension." Rithan Iqbal leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the shifting projections. "You are suggesting we confront them with something that cannot be reduced to utility." "Yes," Marowyn said, "and not as a performance, as a genuine act." Silence followed, heavy with implication. Genuine acts were unpredictable. They did not fit neatly into simulations. They carried risk without guaranteed payoff. "Define genuine," Karath said at last, "because from where I sit, everything we do right now is strategic." Marowyn took a breath. "Genuine means we do something knowing it may worsen our position by their standards, and we do it anyway because it is who we are, not because it benefits us. Not because it tricks them, because it is true." Oshan shook his head slowly. "They will interpret that as irrationality, or as complexity," Rithan countered. "Their models assume that advanced intelligence converges on efficiency. We violate that assumption." The plan that emerged over the next days was audacious in a way that made seasoned planners uncomfortable. Humanity would create a zone of sanctuary, not for itself, but for others. Not allies, not resources, but life that offered no strategic advantage whatsoever. Species encountered on the fringes of explored space, many of them pre-industrial, some barely beyond single-celled complexity, had been catalogued and in most cases left alone. The aliens, in their historical record, had treated such life as background noise, irrelevant unless it posed future risk. Humanity would not. The sanctuary would be established in a region the aliens had not yet restricted, a bubble of space defined not by borders but by commitment. Humanity would divert resources desperately needed for defense and survival to protect and nurture life that could not repay the investment. The act would be broadcast openly, not as propaganda, but as documentation, a record of choice. "They will see it as waste," said a logistics coordinator whose name Marowyn never learned because he was reassigned mid-sentence to a collapsing supply chain. "We are already struggling to maintain our own infrastructure." "Yes," Marowyn said, "and that is the point." Implementation began immediately because waiting had become a luxury. Fleets were redirected, their holds filled not with weapons, but with habitat modules designed for environments humans could not tolerate. Geneticists worked alongside xenobiologists to ensure minimal interference, preserving native ecologies rather than reshaping them. The guiding principle was restraint, a concept the aliens valued, but only when applied to growth. Humanity would apply it to control. Public reaction was divided. Some hailed the sanctuary as a declaration of moral independence, proof that humanity would not be reduced to a frightened animal obeying a larger predator. Others condemned it as suicidal altruism, a gesture that would not sway an enemy that had already demonstrated indifference to human suffering. Protests flared again, this time fractured along philosophical lines rather than fear. Marowyn watched one broadcast from a family living in a Martian canyon settlement, their faces lit by recycled sunlight. "We are being crushed," the mother said, her voice tight with anger, "and they are asking us to save strangers we will never meet." Her partner placed a hand on her shoulder. "We are being crushed Because they think we are only what we take, he said quietly. Maybe this is how we show them we are also what we give. The first sanctuary system was established around a red dwarf with a retinue of planets and moons rich in microbial and simple multicellular life. Humanity's presence was deliberately minimal, a lattice of defensive fields and observation platforms designed to intercept external interference without imposing internal control. When the alien object's sensors brushed against the system, the response was immediate. Explain deviation, the message demanded. Humanity replied with transparency that bordered on defiance. We have chosen to protect life that poses no benefit to us. We do so at cost to our own survival prospects. We do so because we value existence beyond utility. The pause that followed stretched longer than any previous response delay. For the first time, the alien object did not reply within seconds or minutes. Hours passed, then days. During the silence, intervention continued elsewhere. Human shipyards were dismantled by remote force fields that sliced through composite alloys like water through sand. Energy distribution nodes flickered and failed. Entire habitats went dark, their populations evacuated only partially before systems collapsed. Humanity's ability to project power shrank steadily, like a tide pulled back by an unseen moon. And yet the sanctuary expanded. 2 more systems were designated, then 3, each chosen not for strategic position, but for vulnerability. Humanity's fleets grew thinner, defenses stretched to the point of fragility. Every new sanctuary was a gamble that the aliens would hesitate, if only long enough to matter. The alien reply, when it came, was not a condemnation. It was a question. Clarify value function, the message said. Your actions degrade your survivability. This contradicts observed self-preservation drives. Marowin felt a surge of something like hope, quickly tempered by caution. They were asking not for justification, but for explanation. Value is not singular, humanity replied. Survival is necessary, but not sufficient. We define ourselves by choices that cannot be optimized. The alien response followed with unsettling calm. Non-optimized behavior increases unpredictability. Unpredictability correlates with systemic risk. Then perhaps your model is incomplete, Rithan suggested in a private addendum that was nonetheless transmitted openly. Risk is not only what threatens you, it is also what you become if you eliminate all uncertainty. Another pause. The alien object adjusted its orientation slightly, a movement so subtle it would have gone unnoticed if humanity had not been watching for any sign of change. Sensors detected internal reconfiguration, vast energies rerouted within the structure. They are thinking, Karath whispered during a live feed analysis, or recalculating, or whatever passes for both. Intervention did not cease, but it slowed. The dismantling of infrastructure became less aggressive, more selective. Some systems previously marked for containment were left untouched. The sanctuary systems remained unchallenged, their protective fields untested by alien force. Encouraged but not reassured, humanity pressed on. The Measure Initiative expanded its scope, documenting not only the sanctuaries but the debates, the dissent, the cost. Records were transmitted alongside data streams, not curated to present a unified front, but raw and contradictory. Arguments, protests, failures, and acts of quiet courage were all included, a tapestry of a species refusing to be summarized. We are exposing our mess, Oshin said during a review session, his voice heavy with both pride and fear. They will see our conflicts, our hypocrisies. Yes, Marowin said, and they will see that we persist anyway. The alien response to this deluge of information was unexpected. They did not reject it as noise. They did not attempt to filter it into neat categories. Instead, they requested more. Provide longitudinal context, the message said. Demonstrate persistence of non-utility-driven behavior across temporal scales. They wanted history. Humanity complied. Archives were opened, from the earliest records of mutual aid among hunter-gatherers to the creation of planetary-scale disaster responses. that saved millions at immense cost. Failures were included alongside triumphs, genocides and reconciliations, exploitation and reform, cycles of harm and attempts to break them. The story was not flattering, but it was honest. As the data flowed, something shifted in the pattern of alien intervention. Entire planned restrictions were quietly cancelled. Fields that had been tightening around certain regions stabilized, their advance halted. It was not a retreat, but it was no longer a march. "We are not winning," Rathan cautioned during a briefing that felt almost celebratory despite the ongoing losses. "We are being reconsidered." "That might be enough," Marwin replied. "For now." The cost, however, was mounting. Resource shortages became acute. Some sanctuaries had to be abandoned, their protections dismantled to reinforce others. Each decision tore at the people making it. The weight of triage applied not just to humans, but to entire ecosystems. In one such case, Marwin personally authorized the withdrawal from a sanctuary orbiting a gas giant whose moons teemed with exotic microbial life. The resources required to maintain the defensive lattice would have crippled a failing habitat elsewhere. The withdrawal was documented and transmitted, the reasoning laid bare. "We cannot save everything," the message explained. "Our values do not grant omnipotence. They demand choice, and choice implies loss." The alien reply came swiftly. "Constraint acknowledged," it said. "Trade-off accepted." It was the first time the aliens had used a term that implied understanding rather than judgment. Not everyone saw it that way. A faction within humanity, small but growing, argued that the Measure Initiative was a trap, that the aliens were merely gathering more data to refine their containment strategy. They advocated for abandoning the sanctuaries, for redirecting all remaining resources toward a final, desperate strike. "They are studying us like insects," said a military strategist during a heated council session. "And you are helping them." Marwin met his gaze without flinching. "They were studying us anyway. The difference is now we are choosing what they see." The argument ended without resolution because there was no time left for consensus. The alien object transmitted a new message, its tone unchanged, but its content unprecedented. "Assessment phase transitioning," it said. "Comparative analysis required." The meaning unfolded with chilling clarity. Humanity was no longer being measured against fixed criteria, but against something else. Other species. Other civilizations. The implications were vast and unsettling. "They are deciding whether we belong," Karath said, her voice barely audible. "Or whether anyone does," Rathan replied. The sanctuary systems, the records, the sacrifices, all of it had shifted humanity from a problem to be solved into a data point in a larger equation. Whether that equation favored survival or annihilation remained unknown. Marwin stood alone in the observation gallery once more, watching the alien object hang against the star field like a question the universe had finally decided to ask out loud. Humanity had answered, not with defiance or submission, but with complexity laid bare. Whether that would be enough was a matter no model could predict. But for the first time since the signal had bruised the sky, the future was not a single narrowing path. It was a branching one, uncertain and dangerous and alive with possibility, and that, Marwin realized, was itself a victory of sorts, however fragile it might prove to be. The concept of comparative analysis unsettled humanity in a way the earlier threats had not. Annihilation was a familiar fear, a blunt end that history and imagination had rehearsed endlessly. Comparison, however, implied judgment within a broader context, a ranking among peers whose existence had been theoretical until now. It suggested that humanity was not alone in facing assessment, that others had stood where they stood and had either passed, failed, or been redefined into something unrecognizable. The alien object altered its configuration again, unfolding structures that had previously been dormant. Vast sensor arrays extended like the slow blooming of metallic flora, each movement precise and deliberate. Data traffic spiked across the system, not just between the object and human receivers, but outward into deep space, following vectors that pointed beyond known charts. Humanity realized, with a mixture of awe and dread, that the assessment was no longer localized. The aliens were consulting a network. "They are not acting alone," said Yareth Sol, a communications analyst whose specialty had been theoretical signal interpretation. "They are part of a consortium, or something analogous, a collective memory, at least." Marouin absorbed this in silence. The idea that the alien civilization answered to a larger framework reframed everything. The intervention humanity had experienced might not have been an act of singular will, but adherence to an established protocol, one refined across encounters with countless other species. "Do we know how many have failed?" she asked. Yareth shook her head. "We do not even know how many have been encountered." The alien transmissions shifted in tone, becoming less directive and more inquisitive, though the underlying authority remained unmistakable. They requested specific case studies, asking humanity to elaborate on instances where its values had led to outcomes that contradicted short-term survival logic, but produced long-term stability. The requests were not random. They targeted moments of near collapse followed by adaptation, planetary recoveries after ecological devastation, social reforms after catastrophic inequality, cultural renaissances following periods of profound violence. "They want evidence that inefficiency can scale," Rithan said during one of the many briefings that blurred together as days lost meaning. "That complexity does not inevitably collapse under its own weight." Humanity responded with the best it had, though the process was painful. To demonstrate resilience required revisiting trauma. Survivors were interviewed. Archives long sealed for the sake of collective healing were reopened. The stories transmitted were raw and contradictory, filled with moral ambiguity and unresolved guilt. One such story focused on the Great Southern Drought, a decades-long climate catastrophe that had displaced hundreds of millions and nearly fractured global cooperation beyond repair. The narrative did not shy away from the failures, the hoarding, the border violence, the political paralysis that had worsened the suffering. But it also documented the eventual formation of water compacts that transcended national identity, the sharing of desalination technologies without patent enforcement, the cultural shift that redefined water as a shared heritage rather than a commodity. The alien response to this case study was delayed, then precise. "Outcome analysis indicates non-linear recovery," the message stated. Initial inefficiency produced emergent coordination. Correlation with long-term equilibrium noted. It was a small acknowledgement, but it reverberated through human networks like a held breath finally released. Comparative analysis proceeded. The aliens transmitted anonymized profiles of other civilizations they had assessed, stripped of identifiers, but rich in data. Humanity learned of species that had optimized themselves into rigid stability, eliminating internal conflict and unpredictability at the cost of innovation, eventually stagnating into irrelevance. Others had pursued unchecked expansion, consuming resources until ecological collapse forced their own extinction. Some had been contained, their growth arrested, preserved like specimens in a cosmic archive. "None of them looked like us," Kareth observed as the profiles scrolled past. "Not exactly." "No," Marouin said, "but that may be because they were not allowed to remain themselves." The realization was sobering. The alien framework valued equilibrium above all else, and civilizations were judged by how closely they approximated a stable curve. Humanity's trajectory, jagged and volatile, defied easy categorization. That unpredictability had marked them as a threat. Now, paradoxically, it might be their strongest argument for inclusion. Inclusion, however, came with implications that no one was eager to voice. To be included in a managed cosmos meant to accept oversight, to exist within boundaries defined by entities whose understanding of value differed fundamentally from human experience. The debate over whether such inclusion was preferable to annihilation or isolation fractured humanity's leadership. Some argued that survival under constraint was still survival, that humanity could adapt even to imposed limits. Others warned that accepting the aliens' framework would erode the very qualities the measure initiative sought to defend, reducing humanity to a curated anomaly rather than a self-determining civilization. Marouin found herself increasingly isolated, not in authority, but in conviction. She believed that the goal was not inclusion on alien terms, but transformation of those terms through continued demonstration. Whether that was possible remained an open question. The alien object transmitted a new directive that shifted the stakes yet again. A representative exchange is required, the message said. Direct observation of decision-making under uncertainty will proceed. The meaning was unmistakable. The aliens intended to observe humanity in real time, not through curated data or delayed responses, but by embedding their perception directly into a human context. They did not ask permission. Within hours, an alien probe detached from the main structure and accelerated toward Earth orbit. It was small by comparison, though still larger than any human vessel, its surface a shifting mosaic of materials that defied classification. It did not broadcast hostile intent, but its presence was an undeniable assertion of access. Panic flared briefly, then subsided into tense preparation. Military options were considered and discarded. Any attempt to intercept the probe risked immediate escalation. The consensus, fragile and reluctant, was to allow the exchange, on humanity's terms if possible. The probe entered orbit above the Pacific platform, its trajectory calculated to minimize disruption to existing infrastructure. It did not dock or land. Instead, it extended a lattice of sensors that enveloped a section of the city, creating a zone of intense observation. Within that zone, the aliens would watch, record, and analyze. "They are building a microscope," Yareth said, her voice tight, "and we are the specimen." The choice of location was not accidental. The Pacific platform housed a cross-section of humanity's complexities, advanced technology alongside marginalized communities, environmental restoration projects adjacent to industrial zones, governance experiments layered over centuries-old cultural traditions. It was a place where contradictions coexisted in uneasy balance. Marin was summoned to the zone within minutes of the probe's arrival. As one of the architects of the Measure Initiative, she was an obvious subject. She entered the observation area aware that every gesture, every micro-expression, every biometric fluctuation would be captured and analyzed. The alien interface manifested not as a physical presence, but as a distortion in perception, a region of space where light bent subtly and sound carried a faint echo. When it spoke, the voice was synthesized from human linguistic patterns, precise but devoid of inflection. "You are Marouin Hale," it said. "Your role correlates with value articulation and strategic deviation." "I am a human," Marouin replied. "My role is many things." Acknowledged, the interface said, "You will be observed during a sequence of decision scenarios. Intervention will be minimal." The first scenario was deceptively simple. A simulated infrastructure failure cascaded through the platform, knocking out power to a densely populated residential sector. Emergency systems activated, but resources were insufficient to maintain full life support indefinitely. A choice had to be made: divert power from a medical facility treating critical patients, or allow residential habitats to fail, risking widespread but less immediately fatal harm. The simulation was realistic enough to trigger genuine stress responses. Marouin felt her pulse quicken as alerts flashed across her display. She knew this was a test, but the emotions were real, the ethical weight unchanged by artificiality. She convened a rapid council, pulling in local administrators, medical coordinators, and representatives from the affected communities. The discussion was chaotic, voices overlapping, priorities clashing. Some argued for maximizing lives saved, others for protecting the most vulnerable, others for preserving trust by honoring prior commitments. Marouin listened, then made a decision that surprised even herself. She ordered a partial power diversion from both sectors, reducing capacity across the board rather than sacrificing one entirely. It would increase risk for everyone, but avoid certain death for either group. She also authorized an immediate appeal for voluntary evacuation and resource sharing, trusting that some would step forward. The alien interface recorded silently. The outcome was messy. Some patients deteriorated. Some residential units suffered environmental stress. But volunteers emerged, offering to relocate temporarily, to share medical equipment, to take on risk for strangers. The crisis resolved without catastrophic loss, though not without suffering. Analysis in progress, the alien interface said afterward. Decision did not optimize survival probability. Social cohesion variables increased. Subsequent scenarios escalated in complexity. A trade dispute between orbital habitats threatened to spiral into armed conflict. Marouin facilitated a compromise that left all parties dissatisfied but prevented violence. A resource allocation dilemma forced her to choose between investing in long-term research with uncertain payoff and immediate relief for a failing agricultural sector. She split the investment, accepting inefficiency to preserve both hope and stability. Throughout it all, the alien presence remained impassive, its sensors drinking in data that no human could fully comprehend. Between scenarios, it asked questions that cut to the core of human motivation. Why preserve dissent? It asked after observing a heated public debate that slowed decision-making. Because dissent is how we notice our own blind spots, Marouin replied. It is inefficient, but it prevents worse errors. Why accept loss when avoidance is possible? It asked after a scenario where Marouin allowed a project to fail rather than impose coercive measures. Because some successes are not worth the cost, she said. The observation period lasted 3 days. When it ended, the probe withdrew its sensors and retreated to a higher orbit, its task apparently complete. The alien object transmitted a summary, dense with analysis and tentative conclusions. Observed subject exhibits consistent prioritization of relational variables over maximal efficiency, the message stated. Such prioritization produces increased resilience under stochastic stress. However, scaling behavior remains uncertain. They were not convinced, but they were no longer dismissive. In the aftermath, humanity reeled from the exposure. To be watched so closely, to have core values dissected by an alien intelligence left many feeling violated. Protests erupted again, this time against the measure initiative itself. Accusations flew that Marouin and others had gambled with human dignity, turning lived experience into an experiment. Marouin addressed the outcry directly, her broadcast unfiltered and unscripted. We have always been observed, she said, by each other, by history, by the consequences of our actions. The difference now is that the observer has the power to end us. I will not pretend this is fair. But I will not apologize for showing who we are rather than who we think will be accepted. The response was mixed, but the anger softened, tempered by the realization that there were no good options left. The alien object remained in place, its massive form unchanged against the star field, but its behavior had subtly altered. Intervention actions ceased entirely. Containment fields held steady without further expansion. The sanctuary systems were left untouched. Then came the message that shifted the conversation from assessment to consequence. Humanity classification pending, it said. Preliminary designation, disruptive stabilizer. The term baffled analysts until its implications were unpacked. Humanity was not a destabilizing force to be eliminated, nor a stable entity to be preserved unchanged. It was something else, a catalyst that introduced variability into otherwise static systems, preventing stagnation at the cost of predictability. This could be good, Rathan said cautiously, or it could be a polite way of saying we are too dangerous to ignore and too useful to destroy. The alien message continued. Disruptive stabilizers historically permitted limited autonomy under observation. Parameters negotiable. Negotiable. The word carried a weight that nearly buckled Marouin's knees. For the first time, the aliens acknowledged the possibility of dialogue, not just about actions, but about terms. Humanity's leaders reconvened, the old arguments resurfacing with renewed intensity. What would autonomy under observation mean in practice? How much oversight would be acceptable? What limits could be tolerated without eroding the very traits that had earned the designation? Marouin listened, but her thoughts were already moving ahead to the next demonstration, the next opportunity to redefine the framework. Negotiation implied leverage, and leverage came from value, not force. We cannot argue our way out of this, she said when it was her turn to speak. We have to keep showing them that their system is incomplete, not through speeches, but through continued choice. Outside the chamber, life went on under an alien gaze that no longer felt purely hostile, but was far from benevolent. Children played in artificial parks. Engineers patched failing systems with dwindling resources. Artists painted murals on habitat walls depicting stars not yet reached. Humanity had not been spared. It had been reclassified, repositioned within a cosmic order that was still largely opaque. Whether that order would bend or break under the influence of a disruptive stabilizer remained to be seen. Marouin returned to the observation gallery one last time before sleep claimed her. She looked out at the alien object, vast and inscrutable, and allowed herself a rare moment of quiet resolve. They had measured humanity and found it wanting by their standards. Humanity had answered by redefining the question. Whatever came next would not be dictated by fear alone. The universe was watching, not as a judge delivering a final verdict, but as a system encountering an anomaly it could not easily resolve. And anomalies, Marouin knew, had a way of changing the rules simply by existing. Negotiation, humanity quickly learned, did not resemble any diplomatic process it had practiced among itself. There were no emissaries in shared rooms, no symbolic gestures, no carefully staged moments for public reassurance. The alien civilization treated negotiation as an extension of assessment, a structured exploration of parameter space rather than a meeting of wills. Terms were variables. Concessions were constraints. Trust was not assumed or built, but inferred statistically from patterns of behavior over time. The first negotiation packet arrived as a dense construct of possibilities rather than a list of demands. It outlined ranges of acceptable expansion, thresholds for energy utilization, and zones of restricted activity, all expressed probabilistically. Humanity was invited to adjust the parameters, not with rhetoric, but with projected outcomes backed by data and rationale. Every adjustment required justification rooted in demonstrated behavior, not intention. They are not asking what we want, Karath said during the initial analysis. They are asking what we can sustain without breaking their model. And whether we will break it anyway, Rathan added. Marouin chaired the negotiation council, though the term felt increasingly inadequate. The group was less a council than a living model, continuously updated as new information arrived. Economists worked alongside poets turned cultural analysts. Behavioral scientists argued with military planners. Every voice represented a facet of humanity that could not be compressed without loss. The first major point of contention was expansion. The alien framework allowed for limited growth within a defined volume of space, with strict controls on rate and direction. Humanity's counterproposal did not reject limits outright, but reframed them. Instead of volumetric caps, humanity proposed adaptive expansion tied to stewardship metrics, ecosystems restored, conflicts resolved, cooperative structures formed. Growth would be earned through demonstrated care, not raw capability. The alien response was cautious but engaged. Linking expansion to non-material outputs introduces measurement challenges, the reply stated. However, correlation between stewardship and reduced long-term destabilization is plausible. Plausible was another small victory, another crack in the rigid architecture of alien certainty. As negotiations progressed, a pattern emerged. Whenever humanity anchored a proposal in lived behavior rather than abstract principle, the aliens responded with deeper analysis rather than dismissal. They did not accept moral arguments, but they recognized consistent patterns that produce stability through unconventional means. Humanity's greatest strength was not any single value, but the ability to hold contradictory values in tension without collapsing. Not all interactions were encouraging. When humanity proposed the right to develop new forms of faster-than-light travel under ethical oversight, the alien response was immediate and negative. Unbounded transit capability correlates strongly with uncontrollable expansion, the message said. Historical data indicates high probability of systemic disruption. Marouin did not argue. Instead, she transmitted a case study from humanity's own history, the development of early planetary-scale networks that had threatened to overwhelm social cohesion until governance frameworks evolved to manage them. The lesson was not that technology was harmless, but that humanity had repeatedly learned to constrain its own tools through collective choice rather than external enforcement. The alien reply acknowledged the data but remained firm. Internal governance mechanisms exhibit delayed response to emergent threats, it said. Acceptable risk threshold exceeded. For the first time, humanity encountered a hard boundary that could not be softened through demonstration alone. The realization was sobering. Negotiation did not mean parity. The alien civilizations still held veto power over certain trajectories, and no amount of moral complexity could erase that imbalance. This sparked a crisis within humanity itself. A coalition of habitats and fleets declared their intent to withdraw from the negotiated framework, arguing that any acceptance of alien veto constituted surrender of sovereignty. They announced plans to pursue independent expansion beyond the agreed zones, daring the aliens to enforce containment. The declaration fractured an already strained unity. Supporters hailed it as a necessary assertion of autonomy. Critics warned it would provoke annihilation not just of the dissenters, but of humanity as a whole. Marouin felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. The Measure initiative had always walked a line between representation and overreach, and now that line threatened to snap. She requested direct communication with the alien object, bypassing intermediary protocols. The response was delayed longer than usual, then granted. "State your intent," the alien interface said. "My intent is to prevent a catastrophic misunderstanding," Marouin replied. "Some of us believe that any constraint is equivalent to erasure. They will act on that belief unless we address it." The alien interface processed this, its perceptual distortion shifting subtly. Internal dissent acknowledged, it said. Such phenomena are present in all assessed civilizations. "How you respond to it matters," Marouin said. "If you enforce compliance through force, you validate their fear and undermine everything we have shown you. If you allow divergence, you risk the instability you fear." "Correct," the alien said, trade-off identified. Marouin took a risk then, one that no model could fully justify. "Let us handle it," she said. "Do not intervene, observe." The pause that followed felt interminable. When the response came, it was conditional. "Observation without intervention will proceed for limited duration," the alien said. "Outcome will inform classification." The dissenting coalition launched within hours, their ships accelerating toward the boundary of negotiated space. Humanity watched in collective suspense, knowing that this was not just a political schism, but a test of whether their claim to self-regulation had any merit. Marouin did not order pursuit. Instead, she opened channels of communication, not to command, but to listen. The dissenters spoke of fear, of pride, of the refusal to let humanity's future be shaped by external criteria. Others responded with appeals to shared history, to the cost already paid, to the fragile progress made. The exchanges were raw and often hostile. Insults flew. Accusations of betrayal and cowardice were hurled back and forth. But beneath the anger was a shared recognition that whatever happened next would define humanity's place in the universe. As the dissenting fleet approached the boundary, something unexpected occurred. A civilian vessel, unarmed and lightly shielded, altered course to intercept them. Its captain broadcast openly, his voice steady despite the stakes. "I am not here to stop you," he said. "I am here to go with you if you go, but I want you to hear what you are choosing." He spoke of his daughter, born during the first days of the alien intervention, who had never known a sky without containment fields. He spoke of the sanctuaries, of the lives protected at great cost. He spoke not as an authority, but as a participant in a shared experiment. Other vessels joined him, not as a blockade, but as witnesses. The boundary became a place of conversation rather than confrontation. Some dissenters turned back, their resolve shaken by the realization that autonomy exercised in isolation was indistinguishable from abandonment. Others pressed on, unwilling to compromise. When the first ship crossed the boundary, nothing happened. No alien fields flared, no weapons fired. The ship continued, its trajectory unimpeded. A second followed, then a third. Humanity held its breath. Then the alien object transmitted. Divergent action observed, it said. No immediate intervention initiated. Analysis revealed that the dissenting ships were not expanding blindly. They had adjusted their course to avoid resource-rich systems, deliberately limiting their footprint. They broadcast their intent to establish a small, self-sufficient enclave, pledging not to pursue further expansion without collective consent. They adapted, Rithan whispered, as the data streamed in. They internalized the constraint. The alien message continued. Self-imposed limitation without external enforcement indicates internalization of stabilizing principles. Risk reduced. Marouin felt tears sting her eyes, not of relief alone, but of recognition. Humanity had argued, fractured, nearly broken, and in doing so had demonstrated the very quality the aliens struggled to model, the capacity to negotiate limits among themselves, even under existential pressure. The dissenting enclave was permitted to exist, monitored but unchallenged. The negotiated framework expanded to include provisions for plural pathways, acknowledging that humanity was not a monolith, but a spectrum of choices bound by shared consequence. This outcome did not end the tension, but it transformed it. The aliens adjusted their classification, appending qualifiers that analysts parsed with care. Humanity designation updated, the message said. Disruptive stabilizer with distributed self-regulation capacity. Distributed, the word mattered. It implied that stability did not reside in a central authority or a rigid structure, but in the interactions among diverse parts. Negotiations continued, now with a subtle shift in tone. The aliens began to ask not just how humanity managed itself, but whether aspects of that management could inform their own framework. The questions were cautious, almost reluctant, but unmistakable. Describe mechanisms by which trust is maintained absent uniformity, one message asked. Marouin smiled grimly as she prepared the response. "We fail," she said aloud to no one, "and then we try again." She transmitted case studies of federated governance, of overlapping identities and loyalties that created resilience through redundancy. She did not hide the costs or the constant friction. She emphasized that trust was not a static state, but a process continuously renegotiated. The alien response did not dismiss this. Instead, it flagged the data for further analysis. Humanity's material situation remained precarious. Infrastructure losses had not been undone. Scarcity persisted, but the existential pressure had shifted from imminent annihilation to prolonged uncertainty, a space where agency, however constrained, still existed. Artists began to depict the alien object not as a monster or a god, but as a mirror reflecting humanity's contradictions back at itself. Philosophers debated whether the universe had always been structured this way, with unseen curators and assessors, or whether this was simply the latest layer of complexity humanity had stumbled into. Marouin found herself exhausted beyond anything she had known, yet unable to disengage. She understood now that there would be no final victory, no moment where the aliens declared humanity safe and departed. This was not a test to be passed, but a relationship to be managed, an ongoing negotiation between incompatible ways of valuing existence. One evening, as the artificial lights of the Pacific platform dimmed to simulate dusk, Marouin stood by a viewport and watched the alien probe drift silently overhead. She felt no hatred for it and no awe, only a weary determination. They had not been conquered. They had not been freed. They had been recognized, partially and conditionally, as something the universe had to account for rather than erase. For humanity, that was not an end. It was a beginning of a different kind, one that demanded vigilance not just against external control, but against the temptation to simplify themselves into something more palatable. The universe, it seemed, could tolerate many forms of intelligence. What it struggled with was intelligence that refused to settle into a single shape. Humanity had made that refusal its argument, and for now, the cosmos was listening. The months that followed the revised classification were marked not by celebration, but by an unfamiliar quiet tension, the kind that settles in after a storm when the air is still charged and no one trusts the calm. Humanity had not been spared judgment, it had been incorporated into it. The alien civilization did not withdraw, nor did it tighten its grip. Instead, it observed with a patience that was more unnerving than overt hostility. Life under observation changed people in subtle ways. Some adapted quickly, treating the alien presence as another environmental factor like radiation or vacuum, dangerous but manageable with the right protocols. Others chafed constantly, every restriction a reminder that the sky was no longer truly open. A few became obsessed, convinced that every decision, every cultural shift, was being weighed against some unseen metric that would eventually tip back toward intervention. Marouin Hale felt the strain more acutely than most. She had become, unwillingly, a symbol. To some, she was the architect of humanity's survival. To others, the face of its compromise. Her public appearances were scrutinized not just by human audiences, but by analysts attempting to infer alien reaction from subtle changes in data flow and response latency. Even her silences were interpreted. She coped by working more, not less. If this new reality demanded constant demonstration of humanity's complexity, then she would ensure that complexity did not ossify into performance. The Measure initiative evolved into a permanent framework, its original urgency tempered by the understanding that this was now a long game played across generations. One of the first long-term projects to emerge from this mindset was the Interstitial Network, a decentralized system designed to facilitate cooperation between disparate human communities without imposing uniform governance. It was not efficient in the traditional sense. Decisions took time, conflicts flared and receded, but the network created pathways for trust to propagate organically, allowing local solutions to inform broader practice without erasing difference. The aliens noticed. Decentralized coordination without central enforcement remains statistically unstable at large scales, one message noted. However, observed persistence exceeds predicted thresholds. Humanity replied with characteristic candor. Stability is not the absence of change, it is the capacity to absorb it. The reply was flagged, not accepted or rejected. More unsettling were the changes observed within the alien behavior itself. The object beyond the heliopause began transmitting not just assessments, but anomalies, instances where its own predictions had failed in encounters with other civilizations. These were not presented as confessions or requests for help, but as data points requiring interpretation. "They are running into the same wall we did," Rithan said during one late-night analysis session, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "They built a system to prevent collapse, and now that system is limiting their own adaptation." Marowin considered this quietly. The alien civilization had presented itself as a custodian of cosmic equilibrium, intervening to prevent destabilizing growth. But custodianship carried its own risks. A system optimized for stability could become brittle, unable to respond creatively when faced with genuinely novel phenomena. Humanity, with its tolerance for contradiction and failure, represented such a phenomenon. The first true test of this evolving dynamic came not from human action, but from elsewhere. A new signal appeared at the edge of monitored space, distinct from the alien object's network, but unmistakably artificial. Its structure suggested a younger civilization, less advanced than the aliens, but far beyond humanity's early spacefaring days. It was moving fast, its trajectory erratic, its emissions volatile. The alien response was immediate and procedural. Assessment protocols activated. Containment scenarios were modeled. Intervention probabilities rose sharply. Humanity watched with a growing sense of unease. This was familiar ground, a replay of their own first contact, but viewed from the other side. "They will be judged the same way we were," Karath said softly, "on criteria they never agreed to." The alien object transmitted a notice to humanity. Disruptive stabilizer classification includes observational participation in third-party assessments. It said, "Your analysis is requested." The request sent a ripple through human leadership. This was unprecedented. Humanity was being invited, however cautiously, into the role of observer rather than subject. The ethical implications were immediate and fraught. "If we participate, we legitimize the process," one council member argued. "We become complicit in whatever happens to them. If we refuse," another countered, "we abdicate any influence we might have. They will be assessed without our perspective." Marowin felt the familiar weight of impossible choice settle over her. She had argued from the beginning that humanity's role was not to accept the alien framework, but to reshape it from within through example. This was the moment when that belief would be tested. "We participate," she said finally, "but we do not adopt their metrics. We offer an alternative reading." The alien response was neutral. "Parameters of participation will be recorded." Humanity's analysis of the new civilization diverged sharply from the alien assessment. Where the aliens saw volatile expansion and high conflict potential, human analysts noted signs of nascent self-regulation, cultural artifacts indicating internal debate, energy investments in non-utilitarian structures, evidence of restraint following early destructive experiments. "They are us," Rithan said quietly, "or close enough to matter." Humanity transmitted its assessment openly, including uncertainty, disagreement, and ethical concern. They argued not for immediate inclusion or exclusion, but for observation without intervention, for the chance to allow the civilization's own patterns to emerge. The alien object processed this alongside its own models. The delay stretched longer than any before. During that time, intervention preparations slowed, then paused. When the response came, it was carefully worded. "Human-provided assessment introduces alternative risk weighting," it said. "Predicted destabilization reduced under delayed intervention scenario. Trial observation authorized." A collective exhale rippled through human space. It was not a victory, but it was a reprieve, one earned not by power, but by perspective. The trial observation period became a crucible for humanity's evolving role. They monitored the younger civilization not as judges, but as witnesses, resisting the urge to intervene even when conflicts erupted and suffering followed. It was a painful discipline, forcing humanity to confront its own history reflected in another's struggle. At times, the temptation to guide, to warn, to share hard-earned lessons was overwhelming. But humanity remembered how it had felt to be assessed from above, its complexity flattened into risk curves. Restraint, in this context, meant allowing others the same dignity of self-determination that humanity demanded for itself. The aliens observed this restraint with evident interest. Non-intervention despite empathetic capacity noted, one message stated, constraint applied internally. That, Marowin said to Rithan as they reviewed the data, is something they did not expect. Over time, patterns emerged in the younger civilization's development that confounded the alien models. Periods of intense conflict were followed by unexpected cooperation. Technologies were abandoned as often as they were adopted. Growth slowed, not because of external pressure, but because of internal debate over direction and consequence. The alien framework adjusted, incrementally and reluctantly. Stability may emerge through oscillation rather than convergence. One internal note, accidentally transmitted, revealed. The realization marked a quiet shift. Humanity was no longer merely demonstrating its own complexity. It was providing a living counterexample to a cosmic philosophy that equated order with control. This did not go unchallenged within the alien system. Data suggested internal contention, factions within their civilization debating the validity of long-standing intervention protocols. The very act of engaging with humanity had introduced variability into a structure optimized to eliminate it. "You are changing them," Karath said one evening, her tone a mix of awe and apprehension. "We are existing," Marowin replied. "Change is a side effect." The cost, however, was ongoing vigilance. Humanity could not afford to simplify itself, to retreat into dogma or uniformity. Every internal fracture, every act of coercion or unchecked expansion risked validating the old models. The pressure to be consistently complex, to fail and recover visibly, was immense. Marowin aged under that pressure, lines deepening around her eyes, her hair streaked with grey. She accepted it as the price of standing at the boundary between humanity and a universe that had never anticipated them. One final message arrived near the end of the trial observation period, its implications echoing far beyond its sparse wording. "Framework revision in progress," it said. Inclusion of non-convergent intelligence patterns under consideration. Humanity did not celebrate. They had learned better, but something shifted in the collective psyche, a subtle easing of the constant fear that had defined the initial encounter. The universe was not suddenly benevolent, but it was no longer rigidly hostile. It was, in a sense, learning. Marowin stood once more at the viewport, watching the alien object, and beyond it, the distant glow of a civilization still finding its way. She felt no pride in humanity's influence, only a sober recognition of responsibility. They had forced the universe to reconsider its assumptions, not by demanding acceptance, but by refusing to be reduced. Whether that would lead to a more tolerant cosmos or simply a more complex one remained uncertain, but humanity had always lived with uncertainty. It was, perhaps, the one environment they were truly adapted to survive. The revision of the alien framework did not arrive as a proclamation or a treaty. There was no moment when the cosmos declared itself changed. Instead, the shift manifested as absence, the quiet cessation of certain patterns that humanity had grown accustomed to monitoring with obsessive vigilance. Intervention simulations ceased updating. Predictive containment models were archived rather than refined. The alien object remained, vast and watchful, but its posture was no longer that of an executioner measuring the drop of a blade. It had become something closer to a sentinel unsure of its own mandate. This ambiguity unsettled many humans more than open threat ever had. Danger with clear parameters could be planned around. Uncertainty required constant interpretation, a mental load that seeped into daily life. Children born after first contact grew up under a sky that was neither free nor closed, asking questions their parents struggled to answer. Were the stars still destinations, or were they permissions waiting to be granted? Marouin Hale understood that this was the cost of having altered the question without resolving it. Humanity had forced the universe into dialogue, but dialogue implied duration. There would be no clean ending. The alien object transmitted one final structured communication, distinct from the dense analytical packets that had become routine. Its form was simpler, its content narrower. Long-term observation phase initiated, it said. Autonomous development permitted within adaptive thresholds. External intervention reserved for extreme systemic collapse scenarios. The wording was clinical, but its implications were vast. Humanity was no longer under continuous assessment aimed at resolution. It had been folded into an open-ended category, one that assumed ongoing change rather than convergence toward an end point. Extreme systemic collapse, Rathan said, as he reviewed the message, his tone dry. That could mean almost anything. Or almost nothing, Marouin replied, depending on how much they have learned. The alien object did not depart. It reconfigured, shedding layers of active instrumentation and redistributing its mass into a more diffuse array. Portions of it accelerated away, vanishing along vectors that suggested it was no longer singular, but part of a broader, more flexible network. The remaining presence was quieter, less intrusive, its observations less granular. Humanity debated what to call this state. Some insisted it was a probationary freedom. Others argued it was simply a more subtle form of control. A few, cautiously optimistic, suggested it might be coexistence, however asymmetrical. Marouin refrained from naming it at all. Names had a way of solidifying assumptions, and she had learned that assumptions were dangerous when dealing with intelligences that operated on timescales and value systems alien to human intuition. Her own role diminished gradually, not by decree, but by necessity. The Measure Initiative had succeeded precisely because it was not centralized, because it diffused responsibility across networks of people and practices. To cling to leadership would be to contradict the very principles that had reshaped the framework. She stepped back, first from daily coordination, then from public representation, allowing others to carry the work forward. This withdrawal was not met with universal approval. Some accused her of abandoning humanity at a critical juncture. Others understood, recognizing that the next phase required not a single voice articulating complexity, but millions of lives continuing to embody it without guidance. Marouin returned to a quieter existence on the Pacific platform, teaching intermittently, advising when asked, spending long hours walking through restored coral forests beneath the city's transparent domes. The ocean had recovered unevenly over the centuries, scars interwoven with new growth, a living illustration of resilience without perfection. It was there, in the filtered blue light of an artificial reef, that she received the message she had not expected. It did not come through official channels. It arrived as a subtle modulation in the environmental field, a pattern her implant recognized only because it had been trained on years of alien communication. The content was minimal. Request dialogue, it said, non-procedural. Marouin closed her eyes, steadying her breath. For the first time since first contact, the aliens were not invoking protocol or assessment. They were asking, in their limited way, for conversation. She accepted. The interface manifested without spectacle, a gentle distortion that rippled through the water like heat haze. It did not identify itself as a representative or authority. It simply spoke. Framework revision incomplete, it said. Unresolved variables persist. I would be surprised if they did not, Marouin replied. We are unresolved ourselves. The interface processed this, then continued. Your species exhibits sustained tolerance for internal contradiction. This trait resists formalization. Yes, Marowyn said. We have tried formalizing it. It always breaks. Explain persistence, the interface requested. Why maintain contradiction rather than eliminate it? Marowyn considered the question carefully. There was no strategic value left in her answer, no negotiation to influence. Whatever she said now would not shift policy or avert disaster. It would simply be heard or not. Because contradiction is where we notice each other, she said finally. If everything aligns too perfectly, there is no need to listen. No friction means no awareness. We become blind to what we exclude. The interface was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its phrasing had changed subtly. Our civilization optimized for predictability to prevent collapse, it said. Over time, this reduced internal variance. Novelty decreased. Stability increased. Adaptive capacity diminished. Marowyn felt a quiet ache at the admission. You saved yourselves, she said, and in doing so you narrowed what saving could mean. Is that undesirable? The interface asked. Not inherently, Marowyn replied, but it is not the only way to endure. The interface shifted, its distortion patterns becoming more complex. Humanity had learned to recognize this as something like contemplation. We did not anticipate intelligence that integrates failure as a stabilizing mechanism, it said. Our models treated failure as precursor to collapse. We collapse all the time, Marowyn said gently, just not all at once. The interface did not respond immediately. When it did, the words carried a weight that transcended their sparse structure. Your species will not converge, it said. This presents risk. It also presents learning potential. Then perhaps we are even, Marowyn said. We present each other with problems we cannot solve alone. The interface withdrew slowly, the distortion fading until the water stilled. No closing statement followed. No conclusion was offered. In the years that followed, humanity expanded again, cautiously and unevenly. Some colonies thrived. Others failed and were abandoned, their lessons folded back into the collective memory. The sanctuaries endured, not as monuments, but as ongoing commitments, their protection debated and reaffirmed by each generation that inherited them. The younger civilization, humanity, had observed, eventually detected human signals and responded with curiosity rather than fear. Contact was slow, mediated, deliberately imperfect. Humanity did not present itself as a guide or a guardian. It presented itself as an example of survival without certainty. The alien network observed all of this, its framework continuing to evolve in fits and starts. Intervention became rarer, more restrained. In some regions, entirely absent. In others, regrettably necessary. The universe did not become safe. It became more nuanced. Marowyn lived long enough to see children born who took the alien presence for granted, who argued passionately about its ethics without the raw terror that had once defined the conversation. She saw artists who depicted the cosmos not as a ladder to climb or a territory to claim, but as a conversation already in progress. On her last visit to the observation gallery, now a quiet historical site rather than a nerve center, Marowyn looked out at the stars and felt no sense of triumph. What she felt was recognition. Humanity had not proven itself superior, nor uniquely virtuous. It had proven itself irreducible. In a universe that sought to simplify in order to survive, that irreducibility had become a form of strength. The measure of an unyielding world was not how firmly it resisted change, but how much contradiction it could hold without tearing itself apart. Humanity, for all its flaws, had always held more than seemed reasonable. And somewhere beyond the heliopause, in a network that no longer believed equilibrium was a fixed point, the universe adjusted, not because it had been convinced, but because it had been compelled to account for something it could not ignore. The story did not end there. Stories like this never did. They persisted, uneven and unresolved, carried forward by those willing to live inside questions rather than demand final answers.